Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for another breakfast with Blaha. And today it's Greek yogurt, frozen blueberries, almond butter. All right, it's going to be one of those videos where I say I was wrong, right? And that's a powerful thing for people to do today, and that's something not enough people do who are in this area. They're in the fitness and lifting world, who step up and say, hey, I've had a stance on something and I thought it was the right stance. It was well-meaning, well-intending, but you know what? I've realized either through evidence or logical thinking that I was wrong. And when we are wrong, we should correct ourselves, right? It's the intellectually honest thing to do. Have to be able to correct ourselves. I've said in the past that I don't like the idea of pause deadlifts. I don't think they're particularly useful, and in fact, I think they can ingrain negative movement patterns, right, that we don't want. Now, here was my logic behind that. We should generally be lifting explosively on a 1 rep max. We shouldn't ever intentionally decelerate. Our competition lifts need to be fast, they need to be explosive, they need to be powerful. We should be doing speed work. But here's the thing. If we're already doing speed work, isn't that reinforced? On our other rep work, do we have to make everything explosive, or can it be controlled for the purposes of hypertrophy? It can be controlled. It can be controlled. We're learning to follow through with our speed work anyways. So if you're already doing speed pulls every week, particularly speed pulls against bands or chains, you're already programming a primary movement pattern of exploding when you pull off the floor, right? And we're exploding through sticking points. We're exploding through sticking points, especially because oftentimes we start hitting our bands and chains, start getting aggressive at our sticking points. All right, so that's already covered. But here's part of the problem we run into. Do we still have sticking points on a deadlift? And a very common one is before we off the floor is to stick below the knee somewhere. It's where I stick. It's going to happen. It's going to happen sooner or later when you hit a max. A true max, you're going to stick or slow somewhere. It's going to happen. You're not training yourself to do it. It's just going to happen. So if some of your training addresses that for an eventuality, it's not a bad thing. And I had to think this one through because I've noticed, and this is the one that eats at me. Boris Shaco programs pause deadlifts. I know guys with 800 plus pound deadlifts out there who do pause deadlifts. And I have to look at that and go, as historically I've said, well, you know, people can be successful in spite of what they do, not necessarily because of it, and that was my justification. I have a hard time believing that a coach who has produced as many insanely elite lifters as Boris Shaco is wrong. I have a hard time with that, with his level of experience. And he's coached hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of athletes. If something seemed to be inferior, he would probably catch it somewhere and he might not use it. Same thing with some of these really strong guys. And I started thinking about it. If we're not doing it with really heavy work, we're not maxing on a pause deadlift. We're not ingraining that movement pattern. We're doing it as a supplemental lift. We're doing it for hypertrophy. We would technically hypertrophy some of the muscle fibers better right at that joint angle where we're doing the pause. If you pause right about where you often stick, you're having to remove the bar from there with a hypertrophy work. You don't even have to do this with heavy singles. You could be doing this with 5s, 10s. You could do this with 10s. Right? What about the other ends of the supplemental work side? Why do we do accessory work? We do it for weak point training, but we do it for hypertrophy. What is the biggest issue we run into with the deadlift? The deadlift sucks as a hypertrophy exercise. It absolutely sucks. And I challenge anyone to disprove that, and here's why. there's a lot of partial joint ranges involved, and it has an enormous amount of fatigue. In other words, deadlifts beat you up, and if you're doing enough volumes on deadlifts to actually hypertrophy, your recovery is usually taking a pretty big hit. But what other variations do we come up with that are okay? Snatch grip deadlifts, deficit deadlifts, right? We'll do all these things for hypertrophy because we're forced to use a lighter weight. It doesn't beat our structure up as much. Again, this is one of the reasons I think trap bar deadlifts are stupid. You have to use more weight to get the same stimulus. Right? They let you lift more weight for leverage purposes. You're putting more compressive force on your spine. They beat up recovery. They have a horrible stimulus to fatigue. It's probably worse than the conventional deadlift. It's one reason it's a stupid exercise. For that reason, mainly because of the stimulus to fatigue. And deadlifts aren't that bad if you're going to do speed pulls and stuff, which is what we normally do for volume. Those are great. You don't get any advantage from the trap bar from doing that. But stimulus to fatigue is a problem on the deadlift. But these other movements let us move a lighter weight, sometimes into a longer range of motion. Right? We get a longer range of motion. And we end up spending more time pulling through a concentric. All right, so you think, stop and think about the pause deadlift here. We can't lift as much weight. Okay? There's a lot of concentric hang time there to where we have to pull, and then we have a pause where we have to stay tight isometrically, then pull again. Okay, that second pull is going to have a very, very high muscle fiber recruitment from that point to have to reaccelerate from there. There are a lot of muscles in the body. But the fatigue ratio is going to be much lower than a normal conventional deadlift because we're having to use a lighter weight. This is a viable supplemental lift for your deadlift. This is a viable supplemental lift for hypertrophying the muscles of your deadlift. Because again, hypertrophy work sucks on the deadlift. I always build the deadlift and recommend building it with other movements, reverse hypers, hyperextensions, good mornings, extra hamstring work, back work, RDLs, all these other things. This is how I usually build the deadlift because we have to hypertrophy the muscles. This is a viable hypertrophy exercise relative to a conventional deadlift. We'll get just as much muscle fiber recruitment, but it won't beat us up as much because there's going to be less axial loading because we'll be forced to use a lighter weight. But we can still reach momentary muscle failure with it. But we'll do it with a lot less weight for the same reps. This works. And when we look at it in that context, in the context of a larger training paradigm, it's actually a useful exercise. And I am someone who said before, I don't see the point. And I've said that many times. A lot of great coaches and lifters use it, but I don't see the point. It's probably counterproductive. They're breaking records. They're probably not doing a whole lot that's counterproductive. And now when I think of it in this regard as someone who coaches full-time now for years, I coach 7 days a week, and I think through the things that I have to do with my lifters to get them through plateaus, this exercise actually makes sense if we're doing it for rep work, right? Especially if we actually have that weak point. If we have that weak point where we stick below the knee, this is a good exercise. It's a good exercise. I had it wrong for all these years. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.